everybody, and welcome to another episode of PBR TV live sessions. This week we are on episode 10 of our educational series with Paul Glatzel of Powerboat Training UK. Over the last 9 episodes, we have been taking different topics to get you started into boating, maybe go further afield, push boundaries a little bit, but also to hone in your skills to become a better skipper and be safe on the water as everybody gets back onto the water and enjoys boating again after lockdown. So this week we are covering off on advanced close quarter handling the boat in marinas, and getting to know and be more familiar with how a boat handles at slower speeds versus what we were talking about a couple of weeks ago in rough weather conditions. So I'm going to bring Paul in and we will start with today's show. Hi, Paul. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hi, Tom. How are you doing?
All good. Thank you. So, today we're talking things a little bit more slower paced and starting to talk about how to handle the boat at slower speeds. But obviously things affect that, like wind, and there's different drive systems and things that make a whole mix of different equations. So, can you give us a little bit of flavour of what we're going to be talking about over the next 40 minutes or so?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's fair to say that if you ask most boaters, the bit that ends up being most stressful and sometimes the most painful part of it is actually the manoeuvring in and around objects, typically in marinas, slipways, be it at the start of the day or actually almost sort of worse still at the end of the day when you come in tired. You've got everybody sort of keen to get off and maybe go out for a drink, and you've got a nail getting into a difficult berth. Maybe with some challenging conditions of wind and tide. And what we really want to do in this session is to go back and just make sure that you're comfortable, that people have got their mind around all of the various different concepts, because you can't say this berth, this is exactly how we do it, because every day you go in, there's going to be a difference. No 2 days, no 2 berths are ever exactly the same. So by actually just breaking it down into its component parts of how the boat reacts and handles and so on, it's for boating at an advanced level, it's about putting all of those things together and coming up with a package in respect to your response to that berth and those conditions that actually make sure you do a good, safe job each time. Maybe not every time, but certainly the majority of times.
And also, a lot of new people to the water this summer may not be so familiar with the heights of summer in places like Hamble, Salcombe, etc., which are such busy hotspots. There's a lot of noise and a lot of action happening. So it's best to be calm and well practiced in your ability to maneuver your boat and be familiar with how things work, so that you're as safe as possible, especially in busy areas where a lot of people could be affected.
Absolutely. I think the point you're rightly making there is there's pressure from other boats, there's pressure from people on our own boats. And, it's always the case, isn't it? You go into marina and there always seems to be everybody sitting on the back of their boat waiting for you to do something wrong. The reality is they've all been there before. It's just so happened that they're watching you. And at the end of the day, it's all about moving what we do on a boat from really having to think about it lots towards muscle memory, something that just becomes natural to us, just like driving a car. We don't think about changing gear in a manual car, we just do it. The problem with boating is we don't necessarily do it enough to make it muscle memory. And that's the challenge for us. Understanding what we need to do and then practicing it, and that practice makes perfect.
Exactly. So we'll start off with, we've got 10 or 11 different topics and sort of segments to go through. First off, we want to talk about the sort of natural happy position of the vessel. I'll put up the first slide, and if you can chat to us a little bit about what we're seeing here.
Yeah, it's going to, after we've talked through this, it comes across as everybody goes, oh, that's so obvious. And it sort of is, but it's not. And I ask the question very often on instructor courses or with advanced boaters. We put the bow into the wind and point the bow into the wind of a boat, of a powerboat, and say, right, what's going to happen? Is the boat going to stay pointing bow to wind? Is it going to come round to side on one way or the other, port or starboard side to the wind, or is it going to come round stern to the wind? And I think it's fair to say there's never a universal answer to that. when you start to think about it, it sort of starts to become obvious, because when we stop in our powerboat, our motor cruiser, then the boat always ends up leading side on to the waves at 90 degrees to the wind direction, because the boat sort of, you feel it doing that, and it becomes sort of quite unsettling sometimes. So I tend to refer to that as the boat's happy position. The boat is only happy when it's lying beam on to the wind. So therefore, when the boat is bow to wind, it's fighting you the whole time to come beam on to the wind. And how quickly it comes round will vary boat to boat. 4-berth family cruisers with very light bows, heavy back ends, or big ribs with big long bow areas, the bow can come round in any condition, force 4, force 5 wind, in literally 3-4 seconds, really catches you out. One of the things that then really catches people out is what's going to happen stern to wind. So if the stern is to the wind, what happens? And actually, it really surprises people how, if they position their boat stern to wind, how quickly that boat, the bow, will roll upwind and it will lie side on. Now, if there's a big cabin area at the back, somewhere that the wind can get into, then quite often the boat will sort of tend to be pushed downwind quite a lot. But as soon as the wind gets one side or the other, the boat will rotate, and sometimes that's very quick. So why is that important? Well, if you understand that's going to happen, then it's a predictable consequence of having the bow or the stern into the wind. Equally, if you're already side onto the wind, then the boat's not going to rotate. So it's a characteristic which you can use to your advantage and you may need to manage. But if you don't know it's going to happen, then it's going to catch you unawares.
Exactly. So this leads me on to what we were just talking about, having the wind to stern. I'm just going to bring this up now for us. So yeah, can you shed a little bit more light on this and how the boat would handle in this condition? There's advantages, obviously, also putting the engines in astern against the wind. But yeah, can you talk us through a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And you highlight a good point insofar as there are advantages than there are. So bow to wind, the bow invariably comes around fairly fast. Stern to wind, it can come around quite fast, but it takes a lot less physical input of steer and gear, whether you're on an outdrive, outboard type boat or shaft drives. Irrespective of the drive system, it tends to be a lot easier to hold the boat stern to wind than bow to wind. It takes a lot less effort. So why is that important? Well, I'd look at that as your get out of jail free card. So you're in a close quarter situation in a marina, you're losing the bow, it's going, don't worry about it. Just make sure the bow's not going to crash into anything. Get that bum, that stern of the boat into the wind, and just let things settle down. And what you need is thinking time. And because it doesn't take much effort to keep a boat stern to wind, then you've got thinking time, and that's freed up brain space for you to be able to go, right, what I now need to do is X, Y, Z, whatever that actually proves to be. Whereas if you're trying to hold the bow into the wind in windier conditions, that can be quite hard work. So it's just have that as in your back pocket as a get out of jail free type card that you can play if you need to.
Do you think also that helps because there's added weight in the stern traditionally with engines and etc., that it's keeping it more planted into the wind?
Absolutely, and it's to do with the shape of the boat, it's to do with pivot points, it's to do with where the weight is and the very light bow of the boat. Different boats handle in different ways, and if you've got a more mid-engine type boat, then there's more weight towards the centre. It will still come around to lie beam on, but the speed at which it does it varies. I think the point with this is whatever boat you've got, whatever boats you go out in, just do this. Go out in a little bit of winds through to a lot of winds and see how the boat reacts, because being able to put that away in your back pocket is a little bit of knowledge that what the boat's going to do in this situation is. And then quite obviously what we need to do is be reading the wind and the tidal conditions so that we can understand what's actually how the boat's actually going to be affected in those conditions.
Yeah, and we've said on many different episodes that seat time is paramount. So like you say, maybe choose a middle of the week, say if you're on the Solent in handball, say for example, where it's going to be maybe a little bit quieter than on a Saturday sunny afternoon. Yeah, and just spend some time practicing some manoeuvring and obviously do things slowly and not.
Absolutely, and you pick up on what we as instructors a really good adage, which you don't want to look at it quite like this, but if you're going to crash slowly. Things tend to go wrong in marinas because people put lots of power on to solve a problem, and rarely does it solve a problem. It tends to just make keep the gel coat fixers in business. So deal with things slowly. And you need to be able to deal with things and practice away from the glare of everybody. And we don't get good at doing stuff because we practice it once or twice. We need to do something 20, 30 times. And that means ideally, as you say, Tom, a weekday, maybe initially far less wind, and then you build up over time. And I think we've had that as a theme throughout every discussion we've had, is start easy and then progress yourself into more challenging conditions.
Exactly. And also when you're wanting to get into boating, maybe get into something with maybe less windage as your first craft, or something that is of a manageable size. So, or if you're wanting something larger, definitely go in for training, etc. So you're not just running before you can walk.
Yeah, and we mentioned earlier 4-berth family cruisers, and we're here in a marina with about 900 boats in it. And I think it's fair to say whenever you say to an instructor you're jumping on a 4-berth family cruiser, so like a 28-foot 4-berth type boat, and there's a little bit of wind, you can see the slightly sort of ashen look on their face, because they're the hardest boats in the marina to handle. You can have a 60-foot boat with twin shafts and bow stern thrusters. That's easy by comparison with these smaller boats where the wind affects them. It's not a problem as long as you know what to do and you practice it, and then you become in control. It's about you managing the environment, not the wind or the tide managing it.
Yeah. We mentioned a minute ago about rushing things and going in and out of gear and being maybe slightly erratic in sort of a panicked frenzy when people are watching, etc. So that brings us on to steer then gear. So I'll bring this slide up, and if you can chat to us a little bit about what we've got here.
Well, if you've done level 2, Powerboat level 2, then this will be one of the core concepts your instructor will have introduced. And at a basic level 2 type level, it's a critical thing. It's let's get the steering in the direction that when we put the thrust on, we want the boat to instantaneously move. So for example, if we want to turn here in this direction, then if we get the wheel over that way and we put the thrust on, whether it's an outdrive, outboard or shaft drive with a rudder type boat, that kick will be instantaneous. Whereas if we have the steering that way and then we want to go this way, and then it's going to be a slower reaction. So it's thinking, how do I want that boat to react when I put it into gear? It may well be sometimes it doesn't matter, and actually you go into gear and it's a more gradual turn. But other times, particularly in marinas where you want the turn of the bow to be instantaneous, then getting the steering where you want it to be can be a key thing. And that's true whether that's a single engine boat or twins. As we come on to in terms of twin shaft, we can start to look at some twin handling slightly different. But the concept of steer then gear is really important. You may choose to override it, but equally, if you don't see the benefits of it, then you're missing out on a trick in a close quarter situation. Likewise,
it kind of tends to slow things down a little bit, doesn't it? Where you're thinking about your actions more and the position of the drive or outboard. So you tend to be able to analyze things a little bit better, don't you, rather than just going from one lock to the other and sort of going in and out of gear accordingly.
Absolutely. And there's a concept to sort of try and use. I always sort of, when I'm teaching, try to get people to think the word APE, assess, plan, execute, and what their escape route is. What's the wind doing? What's the tide doing? What depth do we have? And if with a good assessment, their plan actually becomes better. And within that plan, we need to remind ourselves that we've got 3 gears on the boat. A lot of situations arise where it gets a little bit sketchy in a marina because people go from forward to backwards, and forget they've got that bit in the middle, neutral. And neutral, you almost think of it like this: when you're in forward gear, you're eating up brain power. When you're in reverse, you're eating up brain power. When you're in neutral, you suddenly got a bit more brain space to be able to think through the problem. So actually try and spend as much of your time within reason in neutral, because it gives you brain space, and actually the boat's then not building momentum one way or the other. And little bits into gear, out of gear, into gear, out of gear can make all the difference. And think about when you're in a close quarter situation. If we guessed, for example, that we needed to leave it in gear for that long, well, actually, rather than leaving it in gear for that long, why not leave it in gear for that bit and then add another bit and then go, oh, actually, I didn't need the bit, but this bit here that I haven't added, because everything you add on, you have to take off. So if you add too much, you're going to have to get rid of it somehow. And that could be against the elements, or it could be having to go to reverse. So add little bit, and then it also reduces the amount of momentum you're creating in a close quarter situation.
Yeah, because if you're going straight from forward to reverse or whatever, backwards and forwards like you're mentioning, the boat will react to prop wash and that momentum that you're talking about. And often you can be crabbing sideways or not have enough steering input, etc., because the boat is actually reacting to everything else, that all the propulsion that you're putting into it.
Well, you're right. And the boat's wobbling around and you've got so many things going on. What your brain can't do is break it down into what's actually having the effect. You've got too many variables and you've got no thinking time. So get to neutral. You've always got far, far more time in neutral than you actually think you have. And that just gives you time to go, actually, the risk is in front of me. Right, okay, I'm just going to reverse gently into winds and stabilize everything while I have a think about what my plan is, what my next move is.
And we're going to talk about twin engines next. But before that, with steer then gear, this is not just single engines, is it? You can engage both engines and come back into neutral, give yourself thinking time. So this isn't just something that should only be employed by single engines.
No, absolutely. And what you might find with twin engines is that being in gear on both engines at the same time actually creates too much speed, too much movement. So you'll find certainly some boats you'll have to alternate which engine you use driving through a marina to diminish your overall speed and momentum. But you're absolutely right in terms of the turn, and we'll come on to this in a moment. If we're turning one way or the other and we've got twin engines, then we need to think about which engine we use. And whether we need to dial the steering in as well, because in some situations you can not use the steering, but there can be a benefit of adding the steering in as well. And it's understanding what each of those component parts of the equation actually are.
Okay, so I'm going to bring that one up, and then we can go through that. So yeah, here we see a diagram of inside and outside engine. Talk us through how a boat reacts accordingly, where you're putting power on a starboard or port engine.
So what we've got here is the sterns of two boats turning. And what we're trying to do is to show really the leverage effect. And what we mean by that is the offset from the center line of the boat. So if this is the back end of my boat, where we've got a single engine, then that's going to be right at the center of that stern. And if we're straight, it just pushes us straight, doesn't it? Whereas if we've got an engine one side and the other side, when we come to push on one side, it's going to have a turning effect one way or the other. And it doesn't matter whether that's outdrives, as in effectively outboards, where the engine is inside the boat and the stern drive unit is on the transom, or whether it's shaft drives. Either way, that offset from the center line creates a turning moment in the boat. And that can work to your advantage. So for example, if we're going to turn this way, then which engine is going to have best effect? Well, it's actually going to be the one on this side, isn't it? Because it's offset from the center line. So we go into gear on the one this side, and it's naturally going to push us that way. And that's without any steering. If we then add the steering in as well, and we turn the steering wheel that way, whether it's a rudder or it's an outdrive, then that's going to increase the tightness. It's going to tighten that turn up. So therefore, we can choose which engine we use. Sometimes we might want a very slow turn, and maybe actually the inside engine actually does a job for us. But actually, most of the time, we'll probably use the outside engine because it gives us greater leverage and creates a tighter turn. So therefore, if you're used to using a single engine boat and doing maybe a turn in a confined space, as you would have learned to do at Powerboat Level 2, then actually when we come to do that in a twin outdrive or a twin outboard type boat, then actually if we're going that way, if we're turning to the left, we're going to use the engine on the right. So in this case, turning to port, we're going to use the starboard engine for forward, but also for a stern because it's got that same leverage. So it's just thinking about that leverage and trying to use it to our advantage.
With maybe a single engine craft, you also have, well, you have it with twins as well, but for creating better leverage as well, you have the option on some craft of a bow thruster. Now we haven't got a graph right now, but obviously it's a little propeller that's molded into the nose of the craft, and some also on the transom. This gives you a different ability as well to be able to crab the boat and control it as well.
Absolutely, and bow thrusters are great. I don't subscribe. Sometimes you get salty old sea dogs or people in marinas go, oh, you can't use the bow thruster, it's cheating. Well, if you paid $4,000 for it to be in your boat, you may as well get some value for it. So it's not cheating, it's a tool. And I think you've got to think why you're going to use it. So if you're going to use the bow thruster to achieve the entirety of the turn, to sort of effectively have a propeller that's pushing the bow that way, then actually what you should do is go back and actually understand how to achieve that in your boat without using the bow thruster. And we've used the phrase already, get out of jail free card, and the bow thruster becomes the bit to tidy up or to solve a small problem. It's a noisy tool generally because it's vibrating in the bow of the boat. So it attracts quite a lot of attention. It's drawing a lot of current. And that might be dedicated batteries or might be off your batteries used for service or start, and that might cause you an issue. So treat it as your extra bit, the bit that's going to help you out, not the be all and end all. But equally, if you have a major problem with your engines, I've known people who've managed to get boats alongside using the bow thruster on one engine or two bow thrusters and just get alongside a pontoon. So, don't hesitate to use it full on if you really need to.
I like that point that you use of using it to tidy up and not just being dependent on that, because if you're just using that, you'll forget your knowledge on using your engines accordingly and properly. I tend to use it where, say, for example, I'm in a motor cruiser and I'm astern towards the current or whatever coming to a pontoon. So I'm coming back in and I'll use the outer engine in reverse to sort of crab the boat in. And then I'll just use a little touch of bow thruster just to stop the nose drifting and bring it alongside parallel or something like that. So you're just using it, like you say, just to tidy up and keep things accordingly.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think it's really important that people don't feel there's any shame in doing that. Just don't subscribe to that at all. These tools are there for a reason. I suspect a good rule of thumb I would have for using a bow thruster is use it for a second and then a second and a second. So it's therefore the addition of a few seconds. The only exception to that would be nowadays you'll get, I was on recently a twin outboard boat, and you even get twin shaft boats where they've got thrusters and then you've got joystick control. And the joystick will actually bring all of those things together, and actually sometimes use quite a bit of revs to actually achieve the objective of moving the boat around. There's nothing wrong with that, but what you'll hear is quite often the thrusters running slightly longer, and they need to effectively pull all those different forces together to get the boat moving where it needs to. But bearing in mind you can make the boat move all over the place all with these joystick controls, then that's a good thing anyway.
Yeah, you've got IPS, haven't you? You've got the Mercury Skyhook system, and a lot of other manufacturers are doing that as well. I think even Seastar have their own aftermarket system for like twin outboards, etc. So that is something. It's
fairly amazing. I don't know if people should go online and have a look at maybe some of the YouTube videos, or we might be able to do one in the future. But actually, the most bizarre one I see is where you're on a boat with two outboards, and then the outboards go in different directions. The boat goes sideways. I just look at it every time, and it still amazes me that we can actually do it. So it's pretty impressive when you watch it.
Yeah, definitely. So that's going to bring us on to our next bit. But before I actually do that, something's popped into my mind regarding bow thrusters. If you have a boat that you are is fitted with a bow thruster and it's a new bit of kit to you, make sure that it's not just in standby mode. If you are coming to a berth or a pontoon, or you feel that you're going to possibly need to use it, there are usually two buttons you hold down, or one, or whatever the system is, but make sure there's a green light maybe in a little bit more of open water. Just give it a quick blip, so that you know that if you do need it, you're not suddenly using a dead stick that's just gone into a standby mode. And like you say, I've seen people almost burn out their thrusters, or it's cut off from a heat overload where people have been overworking them. Paul, have you seen that type of thing? Well,
we in the marina here a few years ago now, a boat caught fire after overusing the bow thruster, and that was and the front cabin burnt out because of, and that's going to be a wiring issue. So people shouldn't unduly worry about that. But you almost speak from experience, Tom, there in terms of the bow thruster having switched on or off at the most inopportune moment.
Yeah, it's happened a couple of times.
Yeah, you and me too, rest assured.
So moving on to the next bit, we're going to talk a little bit about pivot points. So I'll show this picture here that's from the handbook that you were an author of for the RYA. What we seeing here, obviously the port stern is hitting the pontoon, but why is this being caused?
Okay, so if we think back to our sort of basic training, and probably one of the things we would have done on our level 2 course, which would have been driving around mooring buoys in a figure of 8 type style, then one of the concepts that's trying to show to people learning is the concept of pivot points and the way that a boat rotates. And when we're driving forward and we turn left or right, port or starboard, then the boat will rotate around effectively a pole through the boat, pretty much in the position of the helm. So about a third or somewhere between a third and a half back from the bow of the boat. When we start to reverse, then that pivot point moves off to really just forward of the engines, that sort of third forward of the stern. And I think it's just another one of those things to have in our back pocket in terms of knowledge, which is how's the boat going to rotate? So we're starting to maneuver around in more advanced conditions with a bit of wind or moving away from berths. And we need to think, it's very easy to be focused on, right, here I am with the wheel and the throttle, and I'm going to turn this way or that. But what's going on behind you? And this image is just showing that classic example of someone turning, in this case, to starboard to move away from the pontoon, going forward, and the back end just bouncing along that pontoon. Potential for GRP or tube damage or whatever. So it's thinking, how does that boat handle nicely? So in that situation, 99 times, 95 times in 100, I'd be turning yes to starboard, but reversing away from that pontoon. So S shape into the middle of the water and then go off forward. And I think it's at our level 2 level boating that the people watching this are seeking to move forward from perhaps. It's sort of, well, let's push off and drive off, and quite often in a little boat. But actually, we need to have this technique in our back pocket as well, is actually thinking, how's the boat being pushed around by the wind and tide? Can I move away forward without the back end potentially hitting? And a good rule of thumb is, if you're looking over your shoulder worried about what's going on, go out a different direction, because you've probably made life more difficult than it needs to be.
And like we were saying about doing things slowly earlier, the amount of times I've seen people that have maybe been blown onto a pontoon or something, they're in this position and they're about to they're a foot away, say maybe the end cone on the end of a sponson, etc., and they're about to hit. So their first reaction is speed up and turn more aggressively, and then you end up seeing them, wipe down the side of the pontoon or hit another boat or whatever. So speed is not necessarily your friend in this situation.
No, and that comes back to that point. It does go wrong for all of us. Anyone that says it doesn't go wrong for them is just lying, frankly. As it goes wrong for me, I'm sure once or twice in your esteemed career, Tom, it's gone wrong for you. And it just happens. So that comes back to, first off, if you're going to crash slowly. And at the end of the day, it's only GRP and tubes and things like that. Don't risk your hands, your legs, your arms, dangling children over the side of the boat. At the end of the day, protect the people in preference to the boat.
I witnessed a fantastic Japanese engineer, a very, very clever guy, very experienced seaman, who works for one of the major outboard manufacturers, and they had created a new part of their steering system, which enabled you to have better maneuverability off pontoons. And on the evening before the launch, I was with him and jumped off the boat. He got pinned to the pontoon, and even with his great skill and the latest technology that was going to be launched the following morning, was still pinned to the pontoon and did this very thing. So if some of the best people amongst us can have this situation, then it's going to happen to all of us at some point, but just don't freak out and deal with it accordingly.
Absolutely.
I'm going to move on a little bit now to the ability to anchor astern with twins, so another benefit of twin engines. So if I'll pop this on and we can have a little chat about this. So yeah, if you've got a twin engine boat, what's the scenario going on here?
Well, yeah, what we've got here is we've got a twin outdrive type boat, and you can see the image to the left there is the boat slightly angled off the pontoon, and then where we want it to be to the right, parallel to the pontoon. I mean, it just introduces a concept, and it's the concept of being able to sort of effectively lock the stern in a position and rotate the boat using this sort of technique. So what effectively we've done here is the bow's dropped off a little bit, and we want to bring the bow back towards starboard, towards the right-hand side. And we've gone effectively astern on the starboard engine, and we've gone forward on the port engine, and we've dialed steering into starboard at the same time. And what that's done is effectively the back end's rotating, or the boat is rotating around that back end. And you could think of it as sort of anchoring that stern position, and it's that starboard engine that it's really rotating around. So the port engine is giving leverage because of its offset. It's also got turn on, so that's giving it more effect. And then it's that starboard engine that's sort of just sitting it there and stopping its forward or backward movement. So it's just something to practice. If you've got access to a twin outboard outdrive type boat, then give it a try, because it's just another technique to have in your back pocket.
Definitely. With this, people would have seen or maybe heard of an expression called ferry gliding. Now I'm going to bring up the next slide, which sort of expands on this a little bit more. Can you talk us through what we're seeing here and what that term means?
Yeah, so it's sort of what it says on the tin, and it comes from the concept of, if you think of a river flowing with either stream or current or tidal stream, and if we pointed 90 degrees across from our departure point to our destination point, we're not going to end up there, because we're going to get pushed on our side by the stream at that point. So therefore we sort of like angle slightly into it, and we sort of crab across that river, and you see ducks doing it, against the stream or the wind. And it's a concept we should really be practicing in our powerboats and motor cruisers as well, because effectively what we can do is make a boat go sideways. So imagine here it's pointing totally up the page into the forces that are coming down. It could be wind, could be tide, could be both. But by slightly offsetting the bow here to the right to starboard, then as we push forward ever so slightly, then the force coming down the page onto the port bow there is effectively creating two forces. One is down the page, the other is to the right to starboard. So effectively the down force cancels out the up force, and what we're left with is sideways force. And therefore we can go from side to side across this stream, and that's called ferry gliding. It's another tool to have in your back pocket. You won't always be able to do it. You won't always be set up relative to the wind or tide to be able to do it. But if you're taking your boat out and there's water movement, practice it. Ideally, have two buoys, put your boat between them, and then just practice that sort of slide backwards and forward. Or have a buoy, and as you get more confident, come up into the stream, come around the top of the buoy, come down, slide, and box that buoy off. So it's just a good technique. And what you should be able to do is to sort of move and just touch the buoy, and then come back and touch the one the other side. So really practice that. It's a really handy technique. And if you're trying to get alongside a pontoon, and there's some flow through that area, you might well be able to use this just to shuffle the bow over and then slide alongside something.
Excellent. Yeah, it's a really handy skill to use, and I've used it so many times. So yeah, being able to hone this skill, especially as a new boater, and it also gives you a little bit of time as well, because these things happen to a little bit slowly. So yeah, it gives you a little bit of pace to be able to see what's going on.
Just the point you make there, Tom, it's a good one, because it says you talk about it as a boater starting off, and this is the difference in terms of someone becoming a more advanced boater. It's what we're bringing in is loads of different tools and techniques, and when you're starting off, the problem is almost you've got too many things to think of. There's too many senses being bombarded with information, and now you're getting to a stage, hopefully, where some of the simpler things are becoming muscle memory. Then it's having these tools in your toolbox that you can easily take out and apply. But therefore, by reminding you of them, then people will get to go out and practice them, and then draw the right tool from the toolbox to do the right job at the right time.
Yeah, it's honing that skill, isn't it? And I know certainly that there are areas of my boating which I'm not up to scratch on, simply because the majority of my boating is boat tests. It's jumping on with a manufacturer or with a new craft. We get out, we do the boat test for the magazine. So we may be on the water for 3 or 4 hours. We've got drones up, photo boats. We're doing fuel figures. We're doing a lot of that. Or it was previously a racing event or whatever. So it's a very, my time on the water is very work orientated, and there are certain skill sets that I use within that. But also there are other things, like, for example, night navigation, which I haven't done a night passage in 6 months or so. So those type of things for each person will be different, but it's a real useful reminder, isn't it, to be able to hone our skills and develop other things, or just have some useful reminders to be able to keep ourselves at a good high level.
Absolutely.
So we want to talk now a little bit about twin shaft engines. So I'm going to bring in, we've obviously spoken about the outboards, and we've touched on in and out of gear on the two separate engines. But what do we see here?
Yeah, well, I think to a large extent we've probably covered most of this anyway. And the difference, I suppose, outdrives, outboards, twins, is that we rotate those outdrive legs to direct the thrust where we want that thrust to go. Here with the shafts, then we've got a shaft, we've got a propeller on the end. We can't change where that thrust is pointing, and we have behind that a rudder, past which water flows, which creates our steerage. The thing about twin shaft boats is, generally speaking, the shafts will be, because you're on a bigger boat, will be slightly further apart, and that's giving you greater leverage. A general rule of thumb is if the separation between the engines is 1 meter or less, then sometimes you can sort of struggle to get good leverage effect because there's not a huge amount of offset. That said, in fairness, you know, there are some boats that handle really well with just under 1 meter sort of offset. Difference between the two. So what we've got here is these twin shafts, and just the concept of actually using engines against each other. So here, what we're doing is rotating the bow, or rotating the boat to starboard, and we've gone a head on port and a stern on starboard. And this has some additional effects with the shaft drive boats, because effectively, when you put a shaft drive boat astern, so let's say we put the starboard engine astern, then it has two effects, one of which is the turning effect through leverage, but also the propeller sort of crabs its way sideways, and we call that the paddle wheel or the prop walk effect. So it's sort of like a paddle wheel on a steamer. So we go astern on the starboard side, and it has the effect of sort of pulling the bottom of the boat, the back of the boat, towards the port side. Conversely, if we go astern on port, then that has the effect of crabbing the boat towards starboard. So you've got these two effects. You've got the leverage and you've got the paddle wheel effect. And then we can dial in steering as well. So we can actually make, on a twin shaft boat, the turn really in the boat's own length, a very tight turn. And what I tend to do is, driving a twin shaft boat, is center up the steering and just drive it on the engines, one engine against each other, and turn. But then if I need a tighter turn, or I'm not getting the turn I want, then I dial the steering in as an additional. So I sort of separate out those two. I'm not saying that's right, because there will always be slightly different schools of thought on it. But it's well worth jumping on a twin shaft boat and actually seeing how that actually works.
And a lot of them will also have like a rudder gauge, won't they, as well? So you can see where your helm is positioned, rather than, obviously you haven't got outboards or anything that you can see, so having a leg or rudder position is a useful gauge as well. Yeah, and one of the things that we find is we jump on a lot of boats, like twin shaft boats, to do some additional training when people are finding it a little bit more challenging in a marina situation. And one of the benefits of actually just leaving the steering centered is it reduces the number of things you need to think about. Also, don't particularly subscribe to two hands on throttle. You see a lot of people starboard, port, and doing two hands. Well, their brain is having to manage the individual actions of these two hands. I tend to find it easier, and I quite often solve a lot of problems with people. Say, look, take that second hand out of the equation and just use one, and just move your hand from whichever throttle you actually need, and it becomes that one in gear, that one in gear, that one neutral. And it actually then is, your brain is only having to manage one thing. Because if you think of two hands plus you doing the steering, you've got loads of variables. You think of one hand, then suddenly you've actually simplified it a bit. Again, it will vary person to person as to what works. Cool. So we have one of these last photos before we start to move on to then using lines with the boat. What's another practical example here that we see of another scenario that people may come across? Yeah, I think this one, if I can see it correctly, it's basically just the concept of using those engines against each other. And in this situation, we're trying to come away from the pontoon. So what we've done is rotated the bow in towards the pontoon. So rather than just trying to sort of reverse straight out from the pontoon,
by rotating the bow into the pontoon and using that curved shape of the bow to get the bow slightly closer, and then you're giving yourself a far better angle of exit. So don't hesitate to actually roll a bow towards a pontoon. It needs to be fended, or you need to be sure it's not going to touch, and then coming out with a better angle of exit. And that can really help if you've got a boat really close behind you. And then as we'll go on to, we can actually add lines into the equation to add to that as well.
Yes, so this is what I was going to show. So people may see a line attached to the boat and to the pontoon and think, what on earth's going on here? So can you explain what we're seeing here and why this scenario may be really useful?
Yeah, so springs, the use of springs is something that's touched on at the basic courses, but like anything, there's not an awful lot of time to do all these things. So as you become more advanced, you're going to want to think through how you actually use springs to your advantage. So what we've got here is we've got what's called a forward spring. And by forward spring, we mean it arrests the forward movement of the boat. And we've got it from the bollard in the center of that bow on the rib there, back to a position about midships on the pontoon. And you can see wind coming down the page. It could be wind, could be tide, could be both. And that's holding the boat on. And we've got a boat behind and we've got a boat in front. So we need to get that backside of the boat out so we can actually exit up into the wind. And the technique used here is simply to actually arrest the forward movement of the boat and then to turn towards the pontoon, go into gear and roll the bow into the pontoon. It needs to be properly fended, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And then the stern is pushed outwards to a point where you've got a good angle of exit, and then you're going to need to drop that line quickly and reverse out into the clear water. We've got a picture of a rib here, and I'm sort of generally trying not to roll the bow of a rib against a pontoon because there's a risk of damage. A lot of people are sort of, oh, it's a rib, it's got tubes, that's what they're there for. Well, if anyone's ever paid to have a set of rib tubes repaired, it's a lot cheaper to use fenders. And fenders are better, but it's quite difficult sometimes to position fenders at the bow of a rib. So as a general rule of thumb, I'll try not to push the tubes of a rib against a pontoon. I'll do it with a hard boat, but far less so with a rib. With a rib, I'd sort of generally try, and I could take that line from the bollard forward there, turn to, in this case, starboard and go astern and have just the same effect, but be pulling the rib away from the pontoon and therefore not impacting the pontoon. So it's just different techniques. And it's just being mindful of what boat you're on and the pros and cons of doing what you're thinking about doing.
Yeah, it's a good point regarding rib collars, and although they're pretty strong, you don't really want to be having bills for re-gluing, rubbing strakes, or just even scar your nice set of tubes. A lot of tubes are fabric compression, which look lovely. They're beautiful for the super yacht market. For the high-end family boats, they're very, very popular, but also they can kind of show up any mark as well. So
well, GRP, you know, there's people here in the marina I'm in who can make the GRP, you know, fix a bit of GRP and you'd never know they've even touched it. The problem with a rib tube is you've got no choice but to patch it and it will never look the same again. And that's, you know, that sticks out like a sore thumb. So avoid it if you can.
Yeah. So this is the same principle applied, but what's different in this?
Yeah, so what's different here is here you can see the force of the wind or the tide coming up from the pontoon and pushing the boat off. So this is a classic situation where, you know, we struggle to get alongside a pontoon because the forces are pushing us off. And it's just provoking that thought in you of actually thinking about using spring lines to get on. Now, in this example, with this hard boat, we've reversed up to the pontoon. And I remember the first time I was shown this, it was just like, wow, that's just so brilliant. We've reversed up to the pontoon. We've stood in the cockpit area and we've lassoed the cleat. So we've not attempted to get someone onto that pontoon, but we've lassoed the cleat, brought it back on board and tied it off. And we've hung off that pontoon, my babe, 6 foot, 10 foot, whatever. And then we turn, in this case, hard to starboard and just in gear tick over, and the bow will be driven alongside that pontoon. We need to make sure we've got enough room at the stern, that the line is long enough that any bathing platform or that doesn't engage with the pontoon. But here we can sort of drive it in. We could do it the other way, and ribs are classic for this. You could generally got good bow access. So in that case, you drive bow towards the pontoon, lasso the cleat, bring it back on board, and then turn towards the pontoon and gentle into reverse and bring the stern of the boat in towards the pontoon. So great techniques, well worth practicing, and another tool to have in your toolbox.
We're going to show a couple different slides to round this session off. But these ones are showing marina maneuvers, which we've obviously been discussing throughout this stream. But can you sort of talk us through this visual representation, and I'll slowly put the rest of the slides up in order.
Yeah, so it's just introducing some different concepts, and I think the first one here is about reading the environment. It's about looking at what you're about to face. So you're coming into a situation where there are some berths. What way's the wind going? What way's the tide going? What depth of water do I have? What other boats there are? And then that concept of berths that we would refer to as an instructor of closed berths or open berths. If I can see the face of a berth, I'd refer to it as open. If I cannot see, if I'm looking really at the back side of that berth, then I'm seeing a closed face pontoon. Now, that's not a problem necessarily, but if I'm going to go into a closed berth, then probably my momentum is going to carry me away from that, because I'm coming from the other side of it, as it were. So an option will be to go round, turn, and make that an open berth. So my momentum is going to be carrying me onto that berth. It's just making an assessment, isn't it? It's sort of, we shouldn't go in and just charge it in like a bull in a china shop and just start coming alongside. We need to actually take that step back, have a look around, assess the types of berths, and go from there. And then what we've got on the next image, if I can see this, is the concept of it sort of going wrong. And it's just another tool to have in your pocket. So we've got the boat coming in from the right-hand side of the image there. And the wind's coming from the bottom of the page. And it happens to us all. We get just a little distracted and the boat gets pushed towards those finger pontoons and it's getting closer. And then there's the outboard trimmed up off another boat. There's a damn big sharp piece of metal pointing at your boat. And the temptation here is to turn to the left, to turn to port, and to power away, to get away from that risk. And I'm not saying that's wrong, because there will be a time where it's the right thing to do. If you've got enough time and space to do it, it could be correct. But one of the counterintuitive things that you can do is, in this situation, in the little part of the image just to the left there, is look for a space where you could put the bow and counterintuitively turn towards the risk. So in this case, turn to starboard and put that bow into the space. What that's then done is pushed your bum out. So it's giving you a better angle of exit, and then straighten up the wheel, and you might have to use a little bit more than tick over here to actually get the boat out, but then you're pulling the boat away from that risk and potentially holding the stern to wind. So that's one to practice. I wouldn't do it for real next to other people's boats, but putting it into practice is a good one. What we've then got is just some examples of coming into situations, and we've got the wind coming from about the 1-2 o'clock position here. And we've got boats coming into various of these berths. And it's, if we look at the one on the left first, and we've got the rib, rib A boats, we can't really tell it's a rib, seeking to reverse in, and the wind is starting to get on the side of that boat and pushing it towards the corner of that pontoon. Contrast that with the green outlined boat, where it's positioning itself stern to wind, and it's reversing up and then turning to sort of almost flick the bow up into the wind to hold the bow against the wind, and then going back into that slot. I'm not saying one's right or wrong, but it's actually just thinking about, how's my boat going to react to the conditions I'm actually facing here? And then ditto, really doing the one on the right in the same way. Again, if you think about the way the boat wants to lie 90 degrees to the wind, you're trying to go into that berth by going straight up, the boat in red, but the bow wants to drop off to port to lie 90 degrees to the wind. Conversely, coming from the green position and steering into the wind and then just getting into the berth and then let the bow flop away helps you to actually get into that berth. There are so many different scenarios, we can't model every one of them, but it's just having that thought process that helps you to do things. And then we've got this other image, which is just some of the same ideas. We've got the wind from the roughly the same position again, and it's just thinking about how you're setting up. So the one in the middle at the bottom, for example, it's you're going into a berth, you've got wind up your bum and pushing you off the berth at the same time. So you really need to get a line on. And actually an overlooked line quite often is a line for midships. It doesn't actually always work on a rib because you don't have a midships cleat very often or something to tie onto, but you're going into that berth, you lasso the first cleat you get to, and then you let that line extend a bit and you use it as a forward spring to actually prevent and arrest your forward movement. And because you've limited the length of that line such that you can't touch the end of the berth, as it were, it actually naturally brings you alongside. So there's a few different ideas there. It's impossible to model every situation, but it's important that we don't almost try to find a solution to each individual berth, because what you need is the tools and the mental thought process to deal with every berth. You need the tools to do the job, not this is what I do with that berth in that situation. Try and approach it as each individual situation as you face them.
I like what you say also when we were talking about the throttles and having both hands on and overfilling your brain with so many different things going on. In these different scenarios, it's best where you've got a little bit of quiet area of water before making your move, to make sure your lines are ready, fenders are out, that you're breaking down those components, aren't you? So that then you can focus on what the wind's doing or where you're placing your boat, rather than having a million things all happening at the same time. So like that middle cleat, I know, like a lot of most cruisers may have a wheelhouse door by the helm. There's quite often the midships cleat positioned right there. So having a fender on there and also a rope ready to go, those type of things, so you're prepared, ready to make those positions accordingly.
It's a really good point, actually, Tom. And I was doing some training on 2 days ago, and we were on a 4-berth family cruiser type thing. And you had the sacrificial partner that is generally put on the bow, and the bow is sloping like that, and there's the cleat and there's a little rail. But actually, they don't need to muck around with the bow cleat. Midships and the stern cleat, particularly the stern one, because you're in the safety of the cockpit and you're lassoing a line. And if you've not done lassoing a line yet, then have a look on YouTube, and really it should be a lasso. You shouldn't be leaping off boats. It never ceases to amaze me the number of people I see leaping off boats, and you'll get away with it 9 times in 10. It's that one time when you get really hurt, and it's just not worth it. So getting techniques that are low risk, that are proven, and as you rightly say, Tom, it's sort of getting the children sitting down, getting all the lines, briefing people, making sure that the phone's on silent, because Sod's Law says it always goes when you're 15 foot away from a berth.
Always get a call when I'm about to put a boat on a trailer.
Yeah, you and me too.
So everybody, thank you so much for watching today. And Paul, thank you a lot for your time. And we hope that these different techniques will be able to advance your skill set and be able to hone in and be able to make your boating experience more pleasurable by gaining experience and understanding and being more familiar with how the boat moves in wind, how the different drive systems affect the boat, and how you can position your craft accordingly, depending on all the different scenarios that you have. And like Paul said, we can't obviously simulate all the different types of scenarios that you'll come across through your boating life, but by being familiar with how the boat is controlled in these different environments will give you a good basis to be able to come across the right technique for the situation that you find yourself in. Do things slowly, practice when it's safe to do so, and maybe on a quieter day. Go out with maybe a more experienced friend, like we've said on the going further afield episode. Paul, are there any other tips that we should round off on this?
No, and one of the often overlooked things, and it's a phrase I stole years ago from someone, which is let the boat do the work. You know, quite often it just happens to be going where you want it to, and the real temptation is to go into gear, and then that spoils it. You know, let the boat do the work. If it's going there, just let it happen. And if that happens slowly, you don't get any prizes for happening fast. It's about being safe and controlled. And I'll just leave you on this with maybe a little story, which is a lovely way of putting it across. I was doing some training years ago, and there was someone coming alongside a pontoon, and it wasn't totally pretty, but it was totally safe. And the person was beating themselves up unnecessarily. And I turned around to them and said, look, don't be so unfair on yourself. It was good. It was safe. It might be prettier the next time. And this person turned around and said, yeah, me and my partner have a small plane. Every landing we survive is a good landing. Yeah. And actually it's true with boating. You know, it won't always be pretty, but let's just make it always safe.
Yeah, and when you do make a mistake, it does happen. To the most experienced people I've seen all around the world have all still made mistakes. So you're not going to get it right every time. But by being slow, by being prepared, you're going to hopefully keep your family safe. You're not going to damage your boat. You're not going to damage other people's boats. And one other thing that I would like to probably bring out is a lot of marina operators, especially like non-council owned ones like MDL, Premier, Dean and Rederhoff, etc., and others, they will quite often have a dock master or somebody on hand in the week that is checking the boats and working the pontoons. So if you are wanting to focus on something in particular, maybe just give them a call or let them know what you're doing that day, because quite often, if they have got time, they're obviously very, very busy individuals, but if they have got 5 minutes or something, they may help you with your lines and just give you a little bit of guidance that you've got somebody on shore that's obviously very experienced. I'm not saying that dock masters are all ROA instructors and they're very busy on their own jobs, but by calling ahead and just letting them know you're doing some practice, sometimes they are really helpful to help out their members. I don't know if you find that, Paul.
Yeah, absolutely. It varies hugely in terms of experience, but people end up being dock masters in marinas generally because they've got a real passion for boats. And that generally means they've got a boat or had a boat, and they're more than happy to share. And equally, they're quite keen on protecting their marinas as well. So they're very keen to assist.
Yeah, great. Okay, so thank you everybody for joining, and we will be back next week with another episode. These episodes now are kind of really gearing up your boating and advancing these different techniques. We also have planned a new vessel, which we're going to be announcing shortly, which Paul and I will be doing some content around to be able to show you some out of classroom style techniques of what we've been teaching also. If you haven't already, look back on the PBR TV. If you search on that on YouTube or our Facebook page, you will see the previous 9 episodes. There are different topics that talk about going offshore, rough weather handling, understanding tide systems and your charts, etc., using radio. So there are lots of different topics there. So if you've missed any of those, make sure that you have a look back through, because there's loads of content there that will hopefully hone your skills to be a more experienced boater. Likewise, on our live streams, we have live streams coming up with Honda, with Yamaha, with Ray Marine and many other brands. So make sure that you keep an eye on our PBR TV live sessions. But that's all from Paul and I this evening, and thank you very much for joining us, and see you again next week.
Thank you.